Thanks for joining us. I'm Diane Rehm. Bart Ehrman chairs the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's been studying the earliest surviving manuscripts of the New Testament for the past 30 years. He's considered one of the world's top authorities on the early church and the life of Jesus. Now, in a new book, he describes how ancient scribes who copied the scriptures shaped the Bible we read today. The title of the book is Misquoting Jesus. Bart Ehrman joins me in the studio, and throughout the hour, we'll take your calls, your questions. Join us on 800-433-8850. Send us your email to drshow@wamu.org. Good morning to you, sir. It's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
You've written other books about the text of the Bible, but you say that this one is the most important to your own religious journey. How so?
Well, my religious journey began actually when I was a young boy and was attending an Episcopal church, and I guess I was fairly religious, but I had a born-again experience in high school that changed my life for the time. I became a very hardcore evangelical Christian who believed that the Bible was the inspired Word of God without mistakes in its very words. But as I began studying the manuscripts of the Bible, after I learned Greek in college, I started realizing that we didn't actually have the original words of the New Testament, which made it a little bit difficult for my theology, which insisted that these words have been inspired.
Can you tell us a little about that born-again experience in high school?
Well, the born-again experience for most people at that time in the early 70s involved accepting Christ as your Lord and Savior. And it meant acknowledging that Christ had died for your sins and had been raised from the dead, and that you needed to be personally committed to Him. And so the born-again experience meant giving up on your past life and now living a life for God.
What was that past life that you felt you had to give up?
Well, that's the irony now, looking back, of course, as a 50-year-old, wondering what it was that I had to give up when I was only 16 or 17. And I think the idea was simply that people who have these experiences realize that they have an emptiness inside of them, that they're searching for something, and they think that God through Christ can fill that void. And so I think now, looking back, that it was the very common experience of a teenager who felt that there was some emptiness inside, and that this was a solution to the emptiness.
And what happened next? Did you participate in the group in this born-again religious fervor for quite some time? Did you sort of go through a period where you came to doubt what you were doing and then slowly move away?
Well, I as I do with most things, I threw myself completely into this experience and became very active in this Youth for Christ group, and the leader of the group convinced me that if I wanted to be a really serious Christian, I would commit my life to it and go off to study Bible in college. And so I actually, after high school, went to the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago and did a 3-year degree there, majoring in Bible theology. I was a very hardcore, ultra-conservative evangelical Christian then for years. After Moody, I went to Wheaton College, which was an evangelical college. There I studied English literature, and I took Greek. And it was in the process of taking Greek that I started being able to read then the New Testament in the original language.
And it was that experience, reading the text in the original language, that you came to have questions about what you were believing?
Not at first. The reason I wanted to read Greek was because I knew that the New Testament had been written in Greek, and the only way to understand it fully was to read it in the original language. But as I started working through the Greek New Testament, I realized that there are places where we don't know what the original words were because we don't have the originals of any of the books of the New Testament. We only have copies that are made many years later, centuries and centuries later, and these copies all have differences differences from one another, so much so that there are places where we don't know what the original text actually said. And I think that started me down a different path, where I started realizing that the certainties that I had been holding on to, in fact, were uncertain, even to the point of not knowing what the words of the Bible were.
So indeed you began to understand and realize and even conclude that the Bible is a very human book.
This was the major shift, I think, in my thinking, away from thinking of the Bible as completely inspired in all of its words by God, to thinking that, in fact, the book was not only copied by human scribes over the years, but as time went on, and I went on in my education, I went to Princeton Theological Seminary to pursue these kinds of questions, I began to realize that the Bible was also written by humans, and that the human authors, in fact, were very human. And just as the scribes had changed the words of the text, that the human authors themselves had changed the traditions they had inherited about Jesus and about their understanding of the world and God, and that what we have in the Bible isn't a set of books handed down by God, but we have a set of books by very committed religious people, but people nonetheless, very human.
As you moved away from that dedicated religious fervor and into a more intellectual approach to the Bible, did you separate yourself from those people with whom you had previously been so closely associated?
Yeah, this was, for me, part of the real emotional turmoil associated with a change in my perspective, because I was very close to a lot of people, friends, family, who shared my evangelical commitments, and the more I studied, the less certain I was about it, and that created tensions in my personal life, with my friends, my family, and it meant moving from very conservative churches to more liberal churches, and it meant acquiring a different set of friends, and so, in fact, it was part of the struggle for me.
The book is titled Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. Bart Ehrman is the author. He chairs the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's an authority on the history of the New Testament, the early church, and the life of Jesus. Do join us, 800-433-8850. Send us your email to drshow@wamu.org. As you looked at these changes, these differences that you were perceiving as you went through the scriptures in the original Greek, what were some of the examples that you feel significantly changed your outlook and what we perceive as being in the scriptures?
Well, there were several places that originally, even when I was back in college and then early in graduate school, I realized were important for understanding the Bible, places where we have different manuscripts that have different ways of presenting the text. Probably the most famous instance is a story of, it's one of the favorite stories, maybe the favorite story of people from the Gospels, the story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery. This is the story of where the Jewish leaders bring this woman to Jesus for judgment because she's been found committing adultery, and they ask Jesus, are we to stone her according as the law of Moses says? And Jesus then says, let the one without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her, and they all leave because they all also are sinners. After they've left, Jesus turns to the woman and says, is there no one here to condemn you? And she says, no, Lord, no one. And he replies, then neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. It's a wonderful story. The problem is it's not in any of our early manuscripts of the Gospel of John or in any manuscripts of any of our Gospels. In fact, it wasn't originally part of the Gospel of John. It was a story that was added to the Gospel of John by a later scribe. And so even though it was a favorite story that people still love to tell, I mean, it's even in Mel Gibson's movie on the Passion of the Christ, even he has a flashback to the scene. Everybody loves the story, but it's not part of the Bible.
But somebody made the decision that it would be included?
Well, my hunch is what happened is that a scribe knew the story and wrote it out as a marginal note in a manuscript, and that a later scribe, seeing it in the margin, decided to transfer it into the text itself. But this didn't happen early on. It was centuries before this was added to our manuscripts of John.
The story behind the Bible, who changed it, and why. The book is titled Misquoting Jesus. Do join us, 800-433-8850. Lots of email, 800-433-8850. Send your email to drshow@wamu.org. You talk about the letters from the Apostle Paul to churches he established throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. One of our listeners, John, says, please ask your guest when the Bible was written in its current form of chapters and verses. I cannot imagine that St. Paul wrote letters in chapters and verse format. When did the Bible get translated into this format?
Well, it's a very good question. Paul's letters actually are the first books of the New Testament to have been written. He was probably writing about probably in the 50s of A.D., so about 25 or 30 years after Jesus' death. And of course, when he wrote his letters, he probably dictated his letters to scribes who copied them, and then the copies were copied, and the copies of the copies were copied. None of our copies, actually, our handwritten copies, have verse and chapter divisions in them. These are fairly modern inventions. Actually, the chapters were invented in the 12th century for the Latin Bible. The verse divisions that we have were first created in 1551 by a Parisian printer who thought it would be easier if we had verse divisions. And so this fellow named Stephanus was a Parisian printer who added the verse divisions.
So who was actually reading these texts?
Well, in early Christianity, one of the difficulties is that most people were unable to read. This wasn't unique to Christians. Most people in the Roman Empire couldn't read. The best estimates say that something like 90% of the Roman Empire was illiterate. And so the people reading these texts would have been the literate people in the Christian communities. And so every Christian church might have one or two literate people, and they would read these books out loud. And so reading the Bible for ancient Christians meant hearing it read by someone else in the community.
But now, going back to Paul's letters, if they're being copied and copied and copied, can we not assume, or should we not assume, that changes are being made with each copy?
I think the assumption is that changes were made with each copy. And in fact, this isn't just an assumption of scholars. We actually have evidence that changes were being made.
How so?
We have thousands of copies of the New Testament, over 5,700 copies just in the Greek language in which they were originally made. Many of these copies date from the Middle Ages, but some of them go back to the earlier centuries, 2nd, 3rd century. The thing that's striking is that among these thousands of copies, no two of them are exactly alike in their wording. There are thousands and thousands of differences. In fact, there are so many differences among these manuscripts that nobody's been able to count them all. What I usually tell my students is I actually put it in comparative terms and tell them that there are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament.
Well, now, what does that mean in terms of who was doing the changes? Not only that question, but why? And were there political elements being incorporated in each of these changes?
Well, most of the changes, in fact, appear to have been pure accidents. Scribes in antiquity could spell no better than most people can spell today. And, of course, they didn't have spell check, let alone, they didn't even have dictionaries. So there are all sorts of spelling differences. There are accidental mistakes where scribes are sleepy or inattentive, or maybe they simply aren't trained to do the job. There are intentional changes, though, as well. There are places where it looks like scribes have planned to change the text and change it for reasons of their own.
Give me an example.
Well, there are examples that involve a range of issues. For example, there are theological issues involved. Scribes in the second and third centuries, when most of the changes are being made, were battling heresies, and occasionally a text might be usable by a heretical point of view, and so scribes would change the text. Just as a very simple example, in Luke chapter 2, Jesus is in the temple as a 12-year-old boy, and his mother and Joseph have been looking for him because they thought he had gone back with them in the caravan, and turned out he hadn't. So they go back to Jerusalem. They find him in the temple, and his mother says, Jesus, what are you doing here? Your father and I have been looking all over for you. Well, that's a difficult passage for some scribes because that's indicating that Joseph is Jesus' father. But if Jesus was born of a virgin, then Joseph wasn't his father. And so what do you do with a text like this? Well, scribes changed the text so that in these changed texts, in fact, Mary doesn't say, your father and I have been looking all over for you. She says, Joseph and I have been looking all over for you. Or some scribes changed it to say, we have been looking all over for you. Now, it's not a huge difference. That one isn't. But there are other passages that, in fact, are immensely important for Christian theology that scribes change for theological reasons.
Part of the problem in copying these texts is that there was no punctuation, there was no capitalization, if you will, so that it must have been fairly difficult for them to decipher where one thought ended and another began.
Absolutely. In fact, they didn't separate paragraphs or sentences. They didn't even put separations between words. So words ran on together, making it very difficult to copy these manuscripts.
I want to understand that your use of the word heretic and heresy. What kinds of things were they trying to address?
In about 100 years or to 200 years after Jesus, there were different Christian groups who were claiming different things. This comes as a surprise to many Christians today who think that Christianity is one thing. But in fact, in early Christianity was many different things. There were Christians who were claiming that there's not just one God, there are two gods. Some were saying that there were 30 gods. We know of one Christian group that said there are 365 gods.
And they call themselves Christians.
They claimed that these were the teachings of Jesus and his followers, and they had books to prove it, books allegedly written by Jesus' followers. There were some Christians who said that Jesus was human, but therefore he wasn't divine, and there were Christians who were saying that Jesus was divine and therefore not human. There were Christians who said that God created this world, but other Christians said God never had anything to do with this world. And so all of these different Christian groups are battling for converts, and they're all claiming to represent the views of Jesus, and they all have books that verify their views. And so some Christians today might wonder, well, why didn't they just read the New Testament and see that they were wrong? And the point, of course, is that the New Testament emerged out of these conflicts, that the winning side decided which books are going to count as Scripture and which books are going to be excluded. And the books that were excluded then, of course, are deemed heretical, teaching false beliefs, and aren't included in the canon of Scripture. And only the books then, the 27 books that finally made it into the New Testament, are considered canonical.
It sort of takes your breath away when you realize that there's a winning side and a losing side in terms of creation of a text that has become so central to our beliefs, our fundamental religious practices.
Well, that's exactly right. And what's happened among scholars over the last 20, 30, 40 years is that they've begun to realize just how diverse early Christianity was and how these losing sides, in fact, had a lot to say for themselves. And you raised the question earlier about politics. It isn't just politics about theology. It's politics that really matter. For example, issues of what's the relationship of Christianity and Judaism. Are Christians opposed to Jews? Was Jesus opposed to Jews? Well, it depends which text you read. What about the role of women in the Christian church? Are women to be silenced, as some of the books of the New Testament suggest, or are women to have a prominent role in the church? Scribes, who were copying these manuscripts, by the way, changed the text in light of their own views about Jews and about women and other political issues.
Give me an example in regard to women.
There's a passage that's quoted commonly today in the arguments over whether women should be allowed a ministerial role in the church. That's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, where the Apostle Paul, who wrote 1 Corinthians, evidently says that women are to be silent in the churches, that they're not to speak in the church services. This passage, though, is a passage that is under dispute by textual scholars, because there are some manuscripts that put these verses at a different place in the text, and these verses have characteristics in them that make it look like Paul didn't write them. And so it looks like to many textual scholars today that these verses originated as a marginal note by a scribe who was opposed to women speaking in church, and that later these verses got stuck into 1 Corinthians 14, so they're not originally by Paul.
What about the question of homosexual behavior?
Well, the question about homosexual behavior is also a difficult problem, but it's not one that is related to textual issues per se. It has more to do with translational issues. And there the problem is that our term homosexuality, by which we tend to think that people have an orientation of one way or another, and homosexuality refers to a certain orientation. The problem is ancient people didn't talk in terms of orientation and hadn't conceived of the idea of orientation. And so when a word gets translated by the term homosexuality, it conveys precisely the wrong idea to us today. These ancient words, there wasn't an ancient word for homosexuality. So the Greek words that are being translated homosexuality actually had a different nuance in the ancient world.
Such as?
This is a rather complicated topic, as it turns out. The word that normally gets translated homosexuality in the New Testament is a word that's the word is arsenokoites, as the Greek word, and it's a word that hardly ever occurs in Greek literature. Paul may have made it up, but it literally means a man who has sexual intercourse with a man. So the ancient people did know that there were same-sex relationships in the ancient world, but they didn't think it was due to sexual orientation. And the reason it was wrong for people in the ancient world and the Roman world generally is because it meant that one of the men was behaving as a woman by being on the receiving end of the sex act, and that meant that man was being dominated sexually, and domination wasn't acceptable for men.
But those passages have become so debated as to whether, in fact, the whole notion of lying with a man was reviled and would cause a man to be cast out of the church.
Well, the problem is that in the ancient world, when two men had sex, only one of the men was condemned for it, the man who was on the receiving end. And people overlook that contextual fact when they use these passages. It's all part of the problem that people have to put these texts in context, or if they rip them out of context, they misunderstand them.
At 27 before the hour, you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. So one has to say, how good of a translation is the version that most of us are familiar with, the King James Bible?
Well, the King James Bible is obviously a classic of English literature, and I encourage my students to read the King James Bible for its literary merits. There's been nothing like it since. But if what you're interested in is knowing an English approximation of what the authors of the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible actually wrote, then the King James is not a good translation, because the King James translation was based on manuscripts from the Middle Ages that by and large are not very good manuscripts. We've discovered hundreds and hundreds, thousands of manuscripts since the King James translators did their work, and these newer discoveries have shown us that in many places the King James translators simply were translating the wrong text.
Before we take a break, I'd like to ask you about the Christmas story and about the birth of Christ and how each of the texts differs or is the same and how they may have been changed.
The Christmas story, of course, we tell every year where, and the way we tell the Christmas story is that we take the stories found in the Gospel of Luke and the stories found in the Gospel of Matthew, and we conflate them. We put them together into one big story. And so you tell the story where there are shepherds and where there are wise men. You tell the stories about the Herod killing the children and them fleeing to Egypt, and you tell the story about them presenting Jesus in the temple as after he's born for circumcision. This is combining what Matthew says with what Luke says. When you read the accounts carefully, however, I have my students do an exercise. I have them list everything that happens in Matthew's account and everything that happens in Luke's account, and then compare the two lists. And students are struck by the fact that virtually all the stories in Matthew are absent from Luke, and the stories of Luke are absent from Matthew. To the extent that when you compare these lists carefully, it's very hard to reconcile the two with one another. Because in Matthew's gospel, Herod is out to kill the babies in Bethlehem, and so he sends out the troop, but Joseph is warned in a dream, and so they escape to Egypt. In Luke's account, there's nothing about that at all. On the contrary, after Jesus is born, 30 days later, they go to the temple, they perform a sacrifice, and then they return to Nazareth. Well, if they perform the sacrifice in Jerusalem and return to Nazareth, how is it that they fled to Egypt? It's impossible to reconcile these two accounts. And so what we have here are two different accounts of the birth rather than
the virgin birth.
The virgin birth, yeah. So there is, of course, in both accounts, Mary is said to have been a virgin. Some scribes actually tried to emphasize that point by stressing the virginity of Mary in their textual changes they made in the manuscripts, because the scribes copying these texts believed in the virgin birth, and they wanted to emphasize that, and so they would add it in places where otherwise it's not found.
And if you've just joined us, Bart Ehrman, who chairs the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, is with us. His new book is titled Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. Here is an email from Ray in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Your speaker needs to address two concerns. He says, first, does he sharply distinguish between the manuscript evidence and his explanation of the evidence? All too often, Bible critics confuse the two. The one is plain for all to see, the other simply the opinion of a mere man, however learned he may be.
Well, it's a very good question. My students in Chapel Hill, where I have a lot of very conservative students, they take my class on the New Testament, and they find a lot of my interpretations of the text threatening, but they can write them off as interpretations. When I start talking about the material we're discussing, though, they find it very threatening, because now I'm not talking about my interpretation. I'm simply laying out the historical facts. We have thousands of Greek manuscripts, not to mention thousands of Latin ones, and all of these differ from one another in thousands and hundreds of thousands of ways, and there are places where scholars don't know what the original text said. Those are facts.
Here's his second question. Granted that there are many variations, how many of these are in fact errors of any kind, and how may they have real significance for our understanding of the message of the New Testament?
It's another great question. Most of the changes in the text, I would say they're all errors, because they've changed what the text said, and so they're errors to that extent. How many of them are significant? Well, the vast majority of them are insignificant. They're spelling differences, or they leave out a line or a word, and so that's not all that important. But there are hundreds of changes that actually matter, that change the very meaning of the books that they're in, and depending on which manuscripts you trust, the very meaning of the book of the Gospel of John, or the Gospel of Mark, or the book of Hebrews changes depending on which manuscripts you trust. And so I'd say that's pretty significant.
And finally, he says, has any central doctrine of Christian faith been called into question by any of these variations?
Well, yes. In the 18th century, one of the first scholars to start studying these materials was a man in Germany named Wettstein, who ended up losing his teaching post because he pointed out that a number of the changes in the oldest manuscripts compromised the teaching of the deity of Christ. And they threatened the doctrine of the Trinity, and that some of the oldest manuscripts didn't support the traditional views about Jesus as divine. This was dangerous teaching, and as I said, it ended up costing Wettstein his teaching post.
I have so many questions, but we have to go to the phones. Let's go to Charlottesville, Virginia. Good morning, Fred. You're on the air.
Good morning, and thank you for taking my call.
Certainly.
And I'm very excited that we can get your show now.
I am too. Thank you so much.
Bart, I had an experience. I won't call it a religious experience, but a book fell off of a bookshelf about 8-9 years ago, and it was written by Dr. Barbara Thiering, who's a doctor of theology at the University of Sydney in Australia, and she has written several books on Jesus the man. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with her scholarship. I've even attempted to get the Religious Studies Department at UVA to consider offering it as a class because it is just awesome information. Are you familiar with Barbara Thiering?
Yes, I am.
And what do you think of her?
Barbara Thiering is not widely respected among scholars, largely because of her somewhat peculiar ideas about the Dead Sea Scrolls and their relationship to the historical Jesus. The Dead Sea Scrolls actually have nothing to do with the historical Jesus or with early Christianity. They're Jewish documents, and Barbara Thiering is one of a very, very small group of people who've wanted to try and emphasize the relationship of the scrolls to Jesus, Jesus personally.
Thanks for your call, Fred. Here's an email from Kyle in Durham, North Carolina, who says, as your remarks suggest, as does the title of your book, you believe the Bible was changed, presumably from some pure early form. But why do we have to think of this as a corruption? Cannot we envision the Bible as simply a living, changing text?
That's an excellent question. A friend of mine from Birmingham, England, has written a book called The Living Text of the Gospels, in which he actually takes this line where he sees that as scribes change the text, they keep it alive, and I'm fine with that. I think that that most people, though, really want to know what Paul actually wrote. If they read Galatians, they want to know what Paul said in Galatians, and they don't want to know what a later scribe wanted Paul to say. And to that extent, for people of that mode, I would say that these would be corruptions of the text.
All right, to Lafayette, Indiana. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Diane. Thank you for taking my call.
Certainly.
In all these discussions of the Bible and the changing and everything like that, that nobody questions that there's variations in the Bible, but the core doctrine is not questioned by an overwhelming majority of all scholars of shapes and sizes. But I want to ask Mr. Ehrman, do you still believe in the Lord Jesus Christ?
I'm not sure exactly how you mean that.
Do you believe that that Christ died for your sins so that you can be forgiven for them and experience an afterlife in heaven with Him?
Actually, part of the first chapter of my book sketches how I've changed my beliefs over the years from being someone who believed exactly that as an ultra-conservative evangelical Christian to what I am now, which is a fairly happy agnostic.
Does that answer it, Chris?
I suppose so. It's not quite the answer I was hoping for, of course.
Of course. Sorry about that, but that's yes. I am no longer a believer.
Okay, and the second part of it is why it always perplexes me why there's so many questions on the Bible. Nobody questions the writings of Plato, although we have far fewer copies of what he has written, and maybe just a handful, whereas you admittedly say we have thousands of documents of the Bible, and yet everybody has to, get really question these writings. Although that most of the 99% of the errors are just grammatical or minor errors, and it always perplexed me. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't think it's true. I think, in fact, people who study Plato talk all the time about how we don't have the original text of Plato. So it's, maybe it doesn't turn up in church very much, but it does turn up in the academic classroom, that for all works of the ancient world, we have the same problem, that they're copied by hand, and mistakes were made by scribes, whether they're copying Homer or Plato or the New Testament.
Thanks for calling, Chris. Let's go to Miami, Florida, to Joseph.
Yes, can you hear me, Diane?
Certainly can.
All right, great, thank you. Basically, my only point/question is, since Christ obviously never left writings, and there was some form of oral tradition in early Christianity, I'm talking about from his death, resurrection, through what I believe you said Paul is acknowledged as the first writer in the 40s or 50s, there obviously was a Christian faith that was exploding and expanding during that period of time without writings that we know of. So although I understand the importance of the academic arguments and the fact that you're an agnostic now and going through your personal history, isn't there a fact that remains that with all Christians, whatever denomination, that it's a faith in Jesus that has been brought forward from the apostles through the early church and so on, and even though there's been changes or maybe corruptions, as you put it, it's really the story and the facts that existed before any writings that are important.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. The problem is that we don't have any access to these oral traditions about Jesus except through the writings. And so the oral traditions that we have access to are the ones that have been written down. And the bigger problem is that there were lots of oral traditions about Jesus that said lots of different things, some of them saying that Jesus taught that there were 30 gods, some of them saying that Jesus was opposed to Jews, some of them saying that Jesus was opposed to women. I mean, so there are all sorts of oral traditions about Jesus, and the question then for the historian is, which traditions about Jesus actually go back to the man himself? And that's a matter of historical inquiry, that it's a sort of thing a scholar has to figure out.
We've talked about the birth of Jesus, but central to Christianity is his death and resurrection. To what extent do we have consistency in the Bible, in the New Testament? To what extent are there changes as you've seen them?
Well, this is an excellent follow-up to the question about oral tradition, because the traditions about Jesus' death and resurrection, of course, found in the New Testament, are based on stories told about him over the decades between the time of his death and the first accounts of his life and death in the Gospels. Well, another exercise I give my students at Chapel Hill is to have them take the 4 accounts of Jesus' resurrection and simply list everything that happens and compare the lists. And it is striking how different these accounts of the resurrection are. And the question is just about what women went to the tomb on the third day. What were their names? How many of them were there? What did they see there? Did they see a man? Did they see 2 men? Did they see an angel? Was the stone in front of the cave before they got the tomb before they got there, or did it roll away before they got there? What were they told there? What did they do in response to what they were told? Did the disciples go to Galilee to see Jesus, or did they stay in Jerusalem to see Jesus? It depends which gospel you read. All of these gospels had differences, and one of the striking things that the scribes did is they realized that there were all these differences among the Gospels, and so they changed the Gospel so that in the later medieval manuscripts you'll have a lot of these changes smoothed over so that the scribes will
creating consistency.
Yes. They'll try to make the gospel accounts consistent, but in no manuscript are they completely consistent because there are just these vast differences in the accounts of Jesus' death and resurrection.
And what about the crucifixion itself?
Same thing with the crucifixion. Actually, there are numerous differences, and there are places where scribes changed the text in significant ways. An example is in Luke's account of Jesus being crucified. While being crucified in Luke and only in Luke, Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." Now, in early Christianity, this was understood to be a prayer for the Jews who were responsible for Jesus' death. We know that because we have early Christian interpreters who talk about this as a prayer of forgiveness for the Jews. And so maybe it's not surprising, but it is striking that in some manuscripts that prayer is deleted from the text. Well, why would a scribe omit Jesus' prayer for forgiveness for the Jews? because Christian scribes didn't think the Jews were forgiven for the death of Jesus. The scribes who deleted this verse were the ones who were living in a time when Jews are starting to be called Christ killers. And God was angry at them. And in fact, God destroyed the city of Jerusalem because they had killed Christ. And so Christ obviously couldn't have prayed for forgiveness. And so scribes took the verse out.
Very, very confusing for everyone, I think, who hears you, reads the book, and thinks about their beliefs over all these years. At 6 minutes before the hour, you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. And to Kathleen in Athens, Ohio, you're on the air.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. And I think I'm getting another call, but I certainly won't take it. How can anyone believe in a book like this that has changed so often and has seemed to change to benefit those who are rearranging the text? How can one put any faith in the actual text?
The fact is that millions and millions of people do believe in this book, and it's been a source of comfort for millions of people, and a source of hope, and an object of faith. And so,
but are you perhaps in writing your book questioning what that central faith is all about, considering the numbers of changes?
What I'm trying to do is I'm not trying to convert people to become happy agnostics like me. What I am trying to do is to let people see that early Christianity and the books that it's based on was very diverse, that there were lots of different points of view in early Christianity. The different authors of the New Testament had different points of view. The scribes who copied their texts had different points of view, so that this isn't a unified religion at the beginning, it's a diversified religion. And the ultimate goal in seeing that is to realize that we need to tolerate difference, because difference stands at the very heart of this religion.
Well, I think that is a wonderful statement on which to close. The book we've been talking about is titled Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. Bart Ehrman is chair of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks for listening. I'm Diane Rehm.
The Diane Rehm Show is produced by